my talk is really just sort of an overview of sort of the gender basics. I'm not going to go into like the intellectual history of this, like James Lindsay's in the crowd somewhere, and he can go into that, and all the philosophers of that is sort of like providing the scaffolding for all this stuff. But for most parents, they just want to know, like, what are my kids being taught? Why is it wrong? And why is it harmful, basically? So I'm going to try to like really articulate that of where just like it meets the real world. So we'll begin here. So what is gender? So I think this is like a term that has been really confusing for a lot of people, because it's one of those terms where people sort of, they all have this idea of what it means in their heads, but when they talk to people, they find that like other people have wildly different interpretations of what this word actually means. For a lot of people, it's just a synonym for sex. You know, you get a form for the census that asks you your gender, it's just male or female. I studied animal behavior in grad school, so sometimes we would talk about sex differences in animals. That would usually be related to like their physical differences, but when we talked about gender differences, that was usually related to their sex differences in behavior, so that's like another type of way we can use the word gender. And then there's sort of a more, I guess, intellectualized, philosophical way to think about it, common in a lot of feminist literature, which is sort of the sex-related social roles and expectations that are sort of placed on individuals. You know, I guess really just sort of sex stereotypes that are societally enforced on people based on their sex. So that's the one we're going to focus mainly on, because that's kind of what is fueling a lot of this gender stuff. But as you'll see, also there is like a lot of muddling between the definition number 1 and 3. They'll sort of use sex and gender interchangeably, just, you know, in order to, well, it depends on what they're sort of want to get, what they're trying to achieve. They'll sort of just flip-flop. So don't take my word for like how they're defining gender. So I want to talk about the American Psychological Association here. I'm just using this as an example, but really you could just look up any of the major institutions, medical, scientific institutions, of how they're defining gender. So they say that gender here refers to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, activities, and attributes that a given society considers appropriate for boys and men and girls and women. So the stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. If we go to Planned Parenthood, we see how they say that gender, you know, it's a social and legal status, but it's also a set of expectations from society about behaviors, characteristics, and thoughts, how you're expected to act because of your sex. Okay, so again, just sort of stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. This is how they're defining what gender is. You might have heard of the gender binary. A lot of people will use this term. Some people think that when they say the gender binary, they're talking about like the two sexes, like the sex binary. That's actually not what they're talking about, at least most of the time. Sometimes they will go back and forth again between sort of gender and sex definitions. But when they're talking about the gender binary, let's go to the Planned Parenthood definition. It's the idea that gender is strictly an either-or option of male, men, masculine, or female, woman, feminine, based on the sex assigned at birth, which is just biological sex. So really, they define being a woman as being masculine, as being feminine, as being female. So this is really the binary that they talk about. And when someone is described as non-binary, if you have sons or daughters that may have come back from school after reading some of these ideologically torqued books, they might say that they are a non-binary. They know friends that are non-binary. Their friends who say they're non-binary, they're not referring to, they're not saying they're intersex or anything. They're saying that they don't sort of identify as these strict stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. And to sort of drive this point home, this is an actual slide that was used at a UK charity, trans charity called Mermaids, and they make it really explicit here. They have sort of this gender spectrum. They show the binary, which is depicted by a Barbie on one side and a G.I. Joe on the other side. So that would be the binary sort of categories of gender. And then they say there's all these non-binary genders in between them. So I don't see people in the crowd wearing gowns or combat boots, so I can safely assume we're all non-binary in this room. So this might lead you to believe, to ask, well, what do we mean by transgender? How are our institutions defining what it means to be transgender then, given all this sort of intellectual stuff I'm bringing up here? Well, this is the APA, but really this is, if you can look up any of the other organizations like the Endocrine Society, American Psychiatric Association, the CDC, they all almost say this verbatim. So transgender is an umbrella term for persons whose gender identity, gender expression, or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with their sex. Think about that for a second. If your behavior or expression doesn't conform to what's typically associated with your sex, you're trans by definition. If you have a little girl who decides to cut her hair short, well, short hair is not what is typically associated. It's a type of gender expression that's not typically associated with females. By definition, they're transgender. This is how they're like literally defining it. Most people aren't really aware that this is how they've redefined what transgender means. It no longer means transsexual, which was a much more rigid sort of definition that required like a desire to be the opposite sex, maybe even having had procedures to transition. It's now just literally synonymous with just common gender nonconformity. So that's something that I think people need to really sort of understand when they're talking about transgenderism and what people mean when they say it now, because it's expanded just to encompass your tomboys, basically. So this is commonly seen in school. This is the genderbread person. So this is really common. This is in K through 12. I've even had college students send this to me saying this is how they're being taught about sex and gender in their classes at university. So we can see how they're defining gender identity here. And this is confusing for me, and I'm a 37-year-old adult with a PhD in biology. They define the gender identity as how you in your head experience and define your gender based on how much you align or don't align with what you understand the options for gender to be. That's really confusing. And what are kids, when kids read the definition like this, what are they going to base their options for gender to be? Well, it's going to be these rigid stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. And if they didn't get that just by reading that definition, we can zoom in what they say about gender identity in the bottom corner. Gender identity, we have varying degrees of womanness and manness. And this is determined by things like personality traits, jobs, hobbies, likes, dislikes, roles, and expectations. Okay, again, rigid stereotypes. If we look at gender expression, and again, you're trans even if your gender expression differs from what's typically associated with your sex. This is varying degrees of masculinity and femininity. So what determines your gender expression here are things like style, grooming, clothing, mannerisms, affect, appearance, hair, and makeup. Okay, again, if your daughter cuts their hair short, by definition, they're considered transgender now. This is how the definition has expanded, really. So quick overview of this here. What it means to be a boy or girl is now rooted in identity, expression, or behavior instead of biology, according to the whole gender ideology. These identities, expressions, and behaviors are based on sex-related stereotypes of masculinity and femininity. Masculine girls and feminine boys are considered transgender by definition. Now, a lot of people might say, like, well, language evolves, right? Like, why can't we just say, like, okay, instead of gender nonconforming, instead of tomboys, we're just going to consider these kids transgender. What's the harm? Well, there's still like a relic from when being trans was defined as being transsexual. And so there's a really enormous like medicalization component to this. So when a kid is expressing this gender confusion, this triggers like a visit to the gender clinic. This confusion could be interpreted as gender dysphoria to some degree. And there really is just like a pipeline that shuttles kids down this road to like puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and cross-sex surgeries. I mean, so this is very serious. We're not just redefining language. We're medicalizing common gender nonconformity. That's like the point I want to get across here. So it's being medicalized, which is the biggest issue that we have here. It's not just a language game. So a lot of people see this chart. This is like the number of annual referrals to the UK Tavistock Clinic for gender. A lot of people think this is like a big mystery. You see a lot of articles that start off by saying, this is an inexplicable trend. Like, what is causing this huge rise in youth to be confused and thinking that they're trans? Well, I would argue that it shouldn't really be that confusing, because if you expand the definition of what it means to be transgender to literal gender nonconformity, which by their definition of transgender, we all in this room qualify that because we're not wearing ball gowns or combat boots. It's no wonder that we're seeing this huge rise in kids who think they're trans, just gender nonconformity. There's also a lot of myths about biology. As I say, they'll they'll define gender in the terms of these social roles and expectations, but then they also will just flip-flop back and forth between sort of muddling biology. They'll say sex assigned at birth, they'll say gender assigned at birth, they'll use them interchangeably. This has a lot of bad consequences. So it leads to a couple myths. One is that sex is a spectrum or a complete social construct. Another one is that there are more than two sexes. I just have time, I'll talk about the first one briefly. So the sex spectrum, and a lot of people might think it would look something like this, with male and female at opposite ends, and then this vast area of the intersex individuals in the middle. This actually isn't how a lot of the sort of people in the gender world think about sex. They think it's more like a bimodal thing where you have sort of these maxima of males and females. They really don't think males and females are these categorical entities. They think they're more just like statistical realities, like they have varying degrees of maleness and femaleness. And I'll get to that a little bit later with the genderbread, right here actually. So you can see on the genderbread, they talk about biological sex as well. And again, they won't mention males or females. It's just degrees of maleness and femaleness. And interestingly, when they talk about what determines your degree of maleness and femaleness, it includes things like body hair, chest, hips, shoulders, hormones, penis, vulva, chromosomes, voice pitch. None of those things actually define what biological sex is. Where's gametes on this list? The types of gametes that you create, sperm or ova, and your reproductive anatomy that's organized to produce that. That's what makes somebody male or female. But according to this sort of statistical reality of biological sex, a boy who has a higher pitched voice than their friend is less male than their male friend who's got a deep voice. A hairier guy is more male, apparently. Broader shoulders, you're more male. It's crazy. So it's not even just relegated to these like esoteric parts of the world and the universities. It's really quite mainstream. So there's popular YouTube channels that are peddling this stuff. There's Scientific American, Discover Magazine. There's entire books dedicated to the sex spectrum. It was in the New York Times. Why sex is not binary. And then this is what really kind of got me out of the lab, was when Nature ran this article where they talk about sex redefined. Biologists now think sex is a much broader spectrum than just male or female. So it's pretty mainstream, and we see more and more stuff like this seemingly every day. So the intersex argument they make for this whole sex spectrum is basically just sex cannot be binary. If some individuals have sexual anatomy that appears to fall somewhere like in between male or female, they'll give these big diagrams, these really complex figures like this to make it seem so complex. But really, just because we can't define, maybe some individuals have sex ambiguity, this doesn't mean that everyone is sexually ambiguous. So if we want to actually see what the sex spectrum really looks like, this is a figure I made. So the prevalence of intersex conditions is about 0.02% of the population. And even among these individuals, almost all of them can be categorized as unequivocally male or female just after another second glance. So basically, we have people that are trying to say that the existence of this little white box means that the blue and pink box areas don't exist whatsoever, and we should just throw our hands up and say, you should just be able to identify whatever you want, or the people in the blue side can identify as the pink and vice versa. So this is what they're trying to do. They take the little sort of blurry boundary that might exist with one out of every several thousand people and try to make that just be like, well, we don't know exactly where to draw the line between these two people. It's just a social construct. Anywhere you try to draw the line is arbitrary, according to them. So if you thought the gender stuff was a little sort of, I guess, sexist and regressive because it's literally defining what a boy and girl is and a male or female is by sort of their stereotypes of masculinity and femininity, this is the same for the sex spectrum argument too, because, is male A on this chart more masculine, more male than male B? Maybe it's body hair that's on the x-axis here, or is female D more female than female C because they might have, maybe breast size is what's on the x-axis here. This is sort of like this playground bully logic that I like to call it, because you get kids that are bullied for maybe being a really effeminate boy. They'd have sort of feminine features. They might get teased like, what are you, a girl? And according to the whole sex spectrum, like maybe they are, like they could be. You can't actually rule out that possibility according to the sex spectrum. So there's a lot of harms that come with both the whole gender and sex ideas that are being sort of pushed through society. So one that I mentioned earlier is the medicalization of common gender nonconformity. Okay, that's, I think, the biggest issue that a lot of parents have, where they take this natural variation, their tomboy daughters, their sons who are a little bit effeminate, and they're really saying that you're perhaps born in the wrong body. You have a mismatch between your gender identity and your biology, and this can be fixed through a series of puberty blockers or cross-sex hormones and surgeries. Okay, this is a very serious issue that's happening. There's also harms to the gay and lesbian community, because the whole gender ideology has sort of reinterpreted what it even means to be homosexual. It used to be same-sex attraction. Now they're saying that it's the same gender identity attraction. So you could have two males who are a male-male couple. That would be a homosexual relationship. But if one of them happens to identify as a female, now it's a straight couple. So there's a lot of worry in the LGBT community that a lot of the successes that they've had, that they've achieved to normalize sort of same-sex marriages and things like that, can really be overturned because of the TQ plus part, where it's very ideologically driven. And a lot of people might be allergic to that sort of ideology and then just throw out the rest of the acronym altogether, because it's seen as like sort of this, they all come together in one package. This conflicts with sex-based rights. So if you just allow people to completely identify as whatever sex they want, you can't enforce any sex-based rights. You can't have sex-segregated spaces, bathrooms, rape shelters, prisons, sports. If anyone can just identify as they want to, you can't enforce any of these. And that's, that raises serious, fairness and safety issues across the board. I would argue that it's just sexist and regressive. We'd been moving away from this idea that your masculinity and femininity makes you the man or the woman that you are. A lot of the gender stuff has just sort of cemented these sexist stereotypes and rigid notions of what it means to be, of manhood and womanhood. And then it's rooted in a lot of biological pseudoscience that I mentioned about the sex spectrum. I didn't even go into the arguments for why there's more than two sexes and things like that, but it's equally quite insane. So that's sort of my spiel about sex and gender. There's a whole lot more I could say about it, but I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.